To see this in action, we have to implement a few things. First, the table view needs to know about the data source. The data source needs to be initialized with album information, and this is housed in the artist object that we pass through. Let's make the data source a lazy stored property that takes a closure. In there, we can refer to the artist property to get at the albums. So we'll go to the album list controller, and up at the top, we'll say lazy var data source. This is of type album list data source. And we're going to assign a closure that we immediately execute so that inside we can say return album list data source, and we'll initialize this with self.artist.albums. Now that we have a data source, we need to tell the table view about it, which we'll do in viewDidLoad. Table view.dataSource equal data source. When do we assign this artist property though? How do we get the album data in here into this table view controller? When we tap on an artist and segue to the album list controller, we'll set it up for use. In the search results controller, let's provide an implementation for prepare for segue. So at the bottom, we'll say mark navigation. Prepare for segue. The segue identifier here that we need to use or to check for is show albums. So if segue.identifier equal show albums. We can figure out which row the user tapped by querying the index path for selected row property on the table view. But since the data is private to the data source, we need a helper method to get at the relevant object. So before we actually implement anything in here, let's go back to search results data source, and we'll add another method at the bottom. So we'll say mark helper methods. And we'll say func artist at index path, takes an index path argument and returns an artist. And since we are inside the data source object, even though the data is private, we can access it. So we can say return data index path dot row. Now back in the search results controller, once we're in the correct segue, we can say if let index path equal table view dot index path for selected row. And then we'll say let artist equal data source dot artist at index path. Remember that at this point, the artist still doesn't have any album data. That requires a subsequent call to the API to look up and return the album information. But for now, we can resort to using our stub data. So we'll say artist.albums equal stub.albums. So now we have a fully modeled artist object containing albums, and we can assign this artist containing the albums to the album list controller by querying the destination property on the segue. So we'll say let album list controller equal segue.destination, and we'll cast this to the right type, so album list controller. And now we can say album list controller dot artist equal artist. Let's run the app and make sure this works. So we'll hit search, get the fake data, click it, and there you go. That works. Perfect. So we still have one more view to add to the flow before we're done with the UI, and that's allowing a user to select one of these albums and then view all the songs. Now, much of the logic is the same, so we're just going to work through it quickly. This should help reinforce the overall structure of your objects as well. So let's navigate back to main.storyboard, and I'm going to zoom out of here. You can use the controls at the bottom, and we're going to drag out yet another table view controller. And we'll drop it at the bottom. Select the table view controller, and in the attributes inspector, set the style of this table view. Make sure you have the table view selected. And we're going to set the style to grouped, and then we're going to control drag from the album cell here. You might need to zoom in to see this better. where we're going to control drag from the album cell to the table view controller to add our final segue. Now this is going to be a show segue as well, so that we can push it onto the navigation stack. Now the previous segue was called show albums, but this time we're going to show an individual album, so we'll give this storyboard segue an identifier of show album, singular. We also want to use these cells here, these prototype cells, so we'll give the cell a reuse identifier of song cell. Now, while we're here in our cell, let's go ahead and design our custom layout. This cell is going to be super simple. So let's drag out a label for the name. Drop it right there. Now, we won't style this. We're just going to add the constraints. So we'll give the text something like song name. And then we'll align the center Y to super view, basically vertically center this in the container. And then we'll give it a leading space to the super view constraint with a constant value of 8 points. Let's add one more label to display the runtime of the song. So drag another one out, and we're going to place this label on the trailing edge of the cell. Set the text to something like 1:23, basically the time in minutes and seconds. We're going to set the color to light gray. We'll drop the font size just a tiny bit to 14 points. And we want to set this text to be right aligned so that if it increases in size, it goes to the left. And then again, we'll center this in the container and add a trailing space to the super view with a constant value of -8 points. Songs aren't the only things we want to display, though. We arrive at this view by selecting an album from a list, so we should probably show the user which album we're displaying. Let's add a few views to the table view's header view to show information about the album. So from the object library, you're going to drag out a view, a plain view object, and you'll want to move it around until you get this blue line here to indicate that we're dropping it in the table view's header view. We're going to embed the album artwork and album title all as subviews of this view. By default, there's nothing there for the table view header. It's an optional property that accepts a single view, so we can't simply add everything in here. We can only assign a single view instance to act as a header view. So we're going to put that here and then add all the stuff as subviews. With this view selected, go to the size inspector, give it a height of 100 points, and then we're going to drag out an image view. Let's give the image view a height and width constraint of 100 points each as well. And we want to pin it to the top and leading space without any constant value, so right at the edges. Let's use the placeholder image here, and we'll give it a content mode of aspect fit, just like everything else. Now, we're going to keep the rest of the view just like the album cell. So we'll drag out 3 labels, 1, 2, and 3. And for the first one, we're going to set the text to album title and leave the rest of the settings as default. For the second label, the text will be genre. Now we've done all this before, so color is light gray, and we'll drop the font size to 14 points. For the final label, this is how we're going to display the album's release date. So text, January 01, 2017. And remember that this is the date format that we'll eventually be using to show the release dates to users. Color again, light gray, and font again, 14 points. Just like before, we're going to select all 3 of these labels and embed them in a stack view by clicking the Embed in Stack button in the Auto Layout submenu. The axis should be vertical by default if you had it aligned somewhat vertically. We want to give the alignment value leading. We want to set the distribution property to equal spacing, and we'll give it a spacing of 8 points between each of the labels. Now, instead of adding constraints to the labels individually, we just add constraints to position the stack view, and then we'll let it handle the subviews. So leading space to super view, 8 points, and center vertically. Okay, well, let's run all this. and see that for now, we can just load this table view properly and that our segues are working as intended. So when it pops up, search iTunes, click Taylor Swift, we have an album, and we go there. Cool. In the next video, let's add the relevant objects we need to pass all this data around.